You won't believe what was sitting in the back seat of her car when she finally reached the cabin and turned on the interior light. She had driven 3 hours in the dark to get there, 3 hours of empty highway and dense forest on either side, and the kind of total rural darkness that city people genuinely do not understand until they are inside it and cannot find the edge of it. She had stopped once, just once, for a woman standing alone at the side of the road in the rain. A woman who had smiled and said thank you and gotten into the back seat and given her an address that turned out not to exist. Tonight we have 3 true stories from the dark road and the cabin in the woods. Stories that will make you reconsider every empty highway you have ever driven alone, every light you have ever seen through the trees that had no explanation, every sound you have ever heard outside a cabin door at 3 in the morning and told yourself was just the wind. These stories are not comfortable. They are not resolved. They do not end with explanations or reassurances or the warm light of morning making everything feel manageable again. They end the way the dark road ends, in silence, with something you cannot name, and the specific cold understanding that you are very far from anywhere that can help you. Turn your lights off, put your headphones in, and whatever you do tonight, do not open the door if something knocks. Story 1. The Woman on the Road. The first rule of driving alone at night on an empty highway is one that every person who has ever done it knows without being told.
You do not stop.
Not for strangers, not for figures at the side of the road, not for anyone standing in the dark at the edge of a highway miles from any town with their arm outstretched and their face turned toward your headlights. You do not stop. You keep driving. You tell yourself it is probably fine, and then you pass them and watch them disappear in your rearview mirror, and you feel guilty for approximately 4 minutes before the guilt fades and the relief takes its place and you drive on into the dark. I knew this rule. I broke it anyway. It was November, a Friday night. I was driving to my family's cabin, a 4-hour drive through increasingly rural roads that I had made a dozen times before, usually in daylight, always with someone else in the car. This time I was alone because my plans had changed at the last minute, and I had decided to go anyway because the alternative was another weekend in my apartment, and I could not face that. I left the city at 9 p.m., which meant the last 2 hours of the drive would be in complete darkness on roads that had no streetlights and very little traffic, and the kind of silence that rural darkness produces. Total, absolute, pressing against the windows of the car like something physical. I saw her at around 11:15. She was standing at the right shoulder of the road, approximately a mile past a small town I had just driven through. A town with a gas station and a diner and nothing else. She was facing my direction and her arm was raised in the hitchhiker gesture, and she was wearing a light-colored jacket that had no business being sufficient for a November night in that part of the country. I slowed down before I had consciously decided to. I told myself I was just getting a better look. I told myself I was not going to stop. I told myself all the things you tell yourself in the seconds before you do the thing you have already decided to do. I stopped. She came to the passenger window and I rolled it down, and she leaned in and smiled, and she was young, early 20s maybe, dark hair wet from what I realized was a very light rain that I had not noticed because I was inside a car. And she said, "Thank you so much. I've been out here for an hour. My car broke down." I asked her where she was going. She gave me an address, a rural route number, and a box number that meant a property address rather than a street address. I did not know it, but that was not unusual for that area. I said I could take her as far as the junction with Route 9, which was about 12 miles ahead, and where she would have better luck getting help or a signal on her phone. She said that would be perfect. She got in the back seat. We drove. She did not say much. I asked her a few questions. Was she visiting someone? Had she called anyone about her car? And she answered briefly and without much detail, and I put it down to shock or cold, or simply the particular quietness of someone who has been standing alone in the dark for an hour and is relieved to be somewhere warm. At some point I became aware that I had not heard her move in a while. Not a shift in the seat, not a breath, not the small, constant sounds that a person makes when they are alive and present in the back seat of a car. I looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, I want to be very precise about what I mean when I say empty. I do not mean she had moved to a position I could not see in the mirror. I do not mean she had slumped down or fallen asleep below the sight line of the mirror. The back seat of my car was empty in the way a room is empty when nobody has been in it. The door had not opened. I would have heard it. I would have felt the pressure change. The door was closed and locked. I lock my doors automatically when I get in the car, a habit so ingrained I do not think about it. And the back seat was empty, and I was on a dark highway doing 60 miles an hour with no explanation for where the woman I had picked up 12 minutes ago had gone. I pulled over. I got out of the car. I checked the back seat. I checked the trunk. I walked the shoulder of the road for 100 yards in each direction with my phone flashlight on. Nothing. No woman. No sign of anyone. The road behind me was empty and dark and absolutely silent except for the rain that was getting heavier now and the sound of my own breathing, which was not steady. I drove to the junction. I sat in a gas station parking lot for 40 minutes before I felt capable of driving again. I called my sister and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "You stopped on Carpenter Road, right? Around mile marker 14? I said yes. She said, "Don't look it up tonight. Come to the cabin first. We'll talk about it in the morning." I looked it up that night. Of course I looked it up that night. Mile marker 14 on Carpenter Road, November 1987. A young woman walking home from a friend's house. Dark hair, light-colored jacket, hit by a vehicle whose driver did not stop. The driver was never found. The passenger door of my car was wet on the inside when I arrived at the cabin. The seat was damp. She had been there. Whatever she was, wherever she went, she had been real enough to leave the rain behind. I have driven that road many times since. Always in daylight, always without stopping. But sometimes when I am driving the last stretch alone at night and my headlights sweep across the right shoulder of the road, I see something in the peripheral edge of the light that might be a figure and might be nothing, and I keep my eyes straight ahead and I do not slow down and I do not look in the rearview mirror for a long time afterward. What do you think was sitting in the back seat of her car? And do you think the driver who never stopped that night in 1987 ever told anyone what they saw in their rearview mirror? The road gives and the road takes, and sometimes what it gives you follows you all the way to where you were going. The next story proves that the cabin at the end of the dark road is not always the safe place you were hoping it would be. Story 2. Something in the walls. My grandfather built the cabin with his own hands in 1962. I want you to understand that before anything else, because the cabin matters in the way that places built by specific people for specific reasons matter. It was not a rental, not a generic structure, not a place that had been many things to many people. It was built by one man over the course of one summer, and it had been in our family ever since, and we knew every inch of it the way you know a place that has been part of your life since before you can remember. I knew which floorboard creaked near the kitchen. I knew the specific way the wind moved through the gap in the bedroom window frame and made a sound that was almost but not quite a voice. I knew the dark spot on the ceiling of the main room where a leak had been repaired 3 times and never quite correctly. I knew this place the way I knew my own face, which is why I knew, within 20 minutes of arriving on the night I am going to tell you about, that something was wrong with it. It was October. I had come up alone for the long weekend. The drive had been fine, daylight the whole way, familiar roads, the particular pleasure of leaving the noise of the city behind and watching the trees get taller and the traffic get lighter and the world get quieter as you go deeper into the kind of country where the sky is actually dark at night instead of orange from the light pollution of a million lives being lived at close quarters. I arrived at dusk, unlocked the cabin, carried my things in, started a fire in the wood stove, and then I stood in the middle of the main room and felt it. Not a sound, not a smell, not any sensory input I could name and point to. Just the specific cellular certainty that the space around me was different from how it should be, that something had changed in the cabin since the last time I had been here, and that the change was not the kind that came from time passing, or weather affecting the structure, or any of the normal ways a building shifts and settles in the months between visits. The change was the kind that comes from presence, from occupation, from something having been here that should not have been here. I checked the cabin the way you check a place when you cannot name what is wrong but know that something is. Every room, every closet, under the beds, the crawl space access panel in the back bedroom, which was exactly as it should be, the small hook latch secured from the inside the way it always was. Everything was where it should be. Nothing was visibly disturbed. The cabin was exactly as it appeared, empty, quiet, exactly the familiar place I had been coming to my whole life. I told myself I was tired from the drive. I made dinner. I sat by the wood stove with a book and let the warmth and the familiar smell of wood smoke do what they had always done in that place, which was to make everything feel manageable and safe. At 11 p.m. I went to bed. I woke at 2:17 in the morning, not gradually, not the slow surfacing of normal waking, instantly and completely, pulled from deep sleep to full alert in the space of a single heartbeat, the way your body wakes you when it has heard something that your conscious mind has not yet processed. I lay completely still in the dark of the bedroom and I listened. It came from inside the wall, not outside the cabin, inside the wall itself, the space between the interior and exterior panels of the cabin wall to my left, the wall that faced the tree line, a sound that I can only describe as movement. The specific sound of something moving carefully through a confined space, slow, deliberate, traveling along the wall from the corner of the room toward the window. Animals get into walls. I know this. Squirrels, raccoons, mice. This is a known and common thing, and I had heard animals in the walls of the cabin before, and it had never frightened me because I knew what it was. This was not that sound. The scale of it was wrong. The weight of it was wrong. The deliberateness of it was wrong. Whatever was moving through the space inside that wall was doing so with the specific careful slowness of something that did not want to make more noise than it was already making, and it was large. Not mouse large or even raccoon large. The sounds it made as it moved were the sounds of something with real mass navigating a confined space very carefully. It stopped at the window. I know it stopped at the window because the sound stopped directly at the point where the wall met the window frame, and then there was silence for a very long time, and I lay in the dark with my eyes open and my heart beating so hard I was conscious of it, and I thought about the crawl space access panel in the back bedroom that was latched from the inside, and I thought about what that meant, about how something had gotten into the walls and what it meant about where it might be able to get out. I did not sleep again that night. I lay still until the gray pre-dawn light began to come through the window, and then I got up and I packed my things and I left the cabin before the sun had fully risen. In the daylight, I walked the perimeter of the cabin before I drove away. I was looking for any sign of how something might have gotten into the wall cavity. A gap in the foundation, a damaged vent, a place where the exterior cladding had separated. I found one thing. At the base of the wall below the bedroom window, there was a section of exterior cladding that had been pushed slightly outward from inside. Not damaged, not broken. Pushed the way something pushes from the inside when it is trying to get out, or when it has already gotten out and pulled the panel back toward closed behind it without quite succeeding. I called my father that afternoon and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I didn't want to tell you this before you went up there." He told me that 2 months earlier, the neighbor whose property bordered ours had called to say he had seen lights in the cabin on a night when nobody from our family was supposed to be there. He had assumed it was a family member who had gone up without telling anyone. He had not thought to mention it until my father had called to ask him to check on the place. By the time my father had gone up to check, nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. The cabin was exactly as it should be, except the crawl space panel in the back bedroom had been unlatched and relatched from the inside by someone who was still in there when my father had walked through and found nothing and gone home. I have not been back to the cabin alone since that night. I have not been back at all since my father told me what the crawl space panel meant. What do you think was moving through the walls of that cabin? And how long do you think it had been living there before anyone noticed the lights? Some things follow you from the road. Some things are already waiting when you arrive. The final story is the one that has no comfortable explanation and no clean ending, the one that will stay with you longest in the dark. Story 3. Knock once for yes. I have never told this story to anyone who was not there that night, not because I do not want to tell it, but because the telling of it requires me to describe something that I watched happen with my own eyes in a cabin in the woods at 2 in the morning, and that I have never been able to explain in any terms that a reasonable person would accept without questioning my sanity. I am going to tell it anyway, because I think you deserve to hear it, and because I have been carrying it for 11 years, and the weight of an untold story is its own particular kind of haunting. There were 5 of us: myself, my college roommate James, his girlfriend at the time whose name was Petra, and 2 friends of theirs I had met only a handful of times before that weekend. A tall, quiet man named Carl, and his younger sister Wren, who was studying theology at the university, and who had, I would come to understand, a specific and hard-won familiarity with the kinds of things that most people prefer not to think about. The cabin belonged to James's family, remote enough that there was no cell signal for the last 8 miles of the drive, and no neighbors visible from any window, and no sound at night except the forest and whatever the forest contained. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, 5 people, a long weekend, a well-stocked cabin, the particular freedom of being genuinely unreachable for 3 days. The first evening was everything a cabin weekend is supposed to be: fire, food, the kind of conversation that happens when people are relaxed and warm and temporarily released from the weight of their ordinary lives. It was Wren who noticed it first. She had been quiet most of the evening, not unfriendly, unconditional tolerance of abuse, disrespect containedness of someone who is paying attention to things other people are not paying attention to. At around 10 p.m. she put her drink down and looked at the front door of the cabin and said, very quietly and very clearly, "Something is standing on the porch." Nobody laughed. I want to note that because I think in most groups of people that statement would have produced laughter or skepticism, or at least someone making a joke to release the tension. Nobody laughed. Something in the way Wren said it, the complete absence of drama in her voice, the flatness of it, the way you state something observable rather than something frightening, produced in all 5 of us an immediate and total silence. James said, "How do you know?" Wren said, "I can hear it breathing." We all listened. The cabin was silent. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the way it had been moving through the trees all evening, and then in the silence between one gust and the next I heard it, so faint that I genuinely could not be certain I was not imagining it. A rhythm that was almost but not quite the rhythm of the wind, slow and regular and coming from the direction of the front door. Breathing, or something that sounded enough like breathing that the distinction felt academic. Carl stood up. He was the tallest person in the room, and he moved to the door without haste and without the performance of bravery. Just stood up and walked to the door the way you walk to answer it when someone knocks. He put his hand on the door handle. Wren said, "Don't open it." Carl said, "Why not?" Wren said, "Because it hasn't knocked yet. And if you open it before it knocks, you are making a choice it hasn't offered you." I did not understand what she meant, and I do not fully understand it now. But something in those words produced in me a sensation I have never quite been able to describe. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something very high and looking down and understanding for the first time the true distance between where you are and the ground. Carl took his hand off the door handle. He came back and sat down. We sat in silence for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the wall of the cabin and I counted every one of them. On the 11th minute, something knocked on the front door of the cabin. Once. A single knock. Unhurried, deliberate. Not the knock of a person who is cold and lost and needs help. The knock of something that has been standing on that porch for 11 minutes and has decided that enough time has passed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled in the wood stove and the wind moved through the trees outside, and nobody in that cabin made a single sound. After a period of time that I cannot accurately measure, it felt like a very long time and may have been 30 seconds. The breathing stopped. The quality of the air around the front door of that cabin changed in a way I felt rather than perceived through any specific sense. And then the forest outside was just the forest again, making its ordinary sounds, and whatever had been on that porch was gone. We did not discuss what had happened that night, not that evening, not the following morning, not at any point during the remainder of the weekend. We spoke around it the way people speak around something that sits in the center of a conversation too large to be addressed directly. On the drive home, I was alone in a car with Ren for about 40 minutes, while the others drove separately. I asked her what she thought had been on the porch. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think it was something very old, something that has been in these woods long enough that it has learned to be patient, and I think it knocked once because it wanted us to know it was there, not because it needed anything from us." I asked her what would have happened if Call had opened the door before it knocked. She said, "I don't know exactly, but I think the knock was it asking, and I think if you remove the asking you change what comes next in ways that are very difficult to come back from." I have thought about that answer for 11 years. I have thought about the 11 minutes of waiting and the single knock and the specific quality of the silence afterward when whatever it was decided that we had given it the right answer simply by staying still and not opening the door and letting it ask in its own time. I have thought about what it means that something old enough and patient enough to stand motionless on a cabin porch in the dark for 11 minutes felt it necessary to knock at all. And I have thought about the fact that somewhere in those woods right now it is still waiting, still patient, still old, possibly standing on a porch somewhere listening to the people inside decide whether to open the door. What do you think was standing on that porch? And what do you think would have happened if someone had opened the door before it knocked? Thank you for listening. 3 stories from the dark road and the cabin in the woods. The woman who dissolved from the back seat of a car on a November highway and left the rain behind on the seat where she had been sitting. The thing that had been living inside the walls of a family cabin long enough to know exactly how to latch the crawl space panel from the inside. And something very old and very patient that stood on a porch in the dark for 11 minutes and knocked once and then walked back into the forest when nobody answered. No explanations, no comfortable resolutions. No light at the end of any of these roads that makes what happened on them feel like something you can put down and walk away from. Just the dark, and the things that live in it, and the specific cold understanding that they have been there much longer than we have. If you are listening to this in the dark right now, in bed, headphones in, the world quiet around you, do not look at the window, do not listen too hard to the silence outside your door, and if something knocks tonight, let it knock once first, before you decide what to do next. Like and subscribe for new horror stories every single week, and leave a comment telling me which story you are still thinking about. We read every single one. Good night, sleep well, or try.